Well, hello there, Space Monkeys. Welcome to Political Fight Club. I'm Robert Durden, and in this episode, we're going to be talking about Bellingcat. We're going to do kind of a review or a crash course if you don't know anything about Bellingcat. Bellingcat is an investigative journalist outlet that is basically just kind of working with the State Department. It gets a lot of its funding and works very closely with the National Endowment for Democracy, which we know is like a CIA cutout, and they get caught running with unverified stories all the time, especially when it comes down to manufacturing consent for war or coups, or when it comes down to destabilizing a region by meddling in their elections or trying to sway votes. They get caught doing this all the time, and I'd like to again showcase another wonderful writer who I want to promote today, somebody who's actually one of my INN comrades. The Dissident has written 2 articles recently at the end of March about Bellingcat. They've gotten caught with their hand in the cookie jar again, and mostly what you've heard me talk about on this show as far as what I know Bellingcat has done is in regards to Syria and the OPCW cover-up. Bellingcat was the source of a lot of the smears against the OPCW whistleblowers who, again, blew the whistle on that Assad did not, in fact, gas his own people, but also a lot of the false narratives kind of discrediting them and saying that they couldn't have come to any of the conclusions that they came to, like that some of them weren't actually there. That's not true. All of that came from Bellingcat. So I've always that's what I'm talking about when I've referenced Bellingcat as being sort of like a State Department associated propaganda outlet. So this is going to review some of those things, among other things that I didn't know about. And again, it's like a refresher course, and I highly recommend you go and read these for yourself. The Dissident on Substack is where I got these from. The first one's from March 28th, and it's going to talk about just basically the new bullshit that they're up to. And then the second one is kind of like a crash course and review of all the other things that they've gotten caught doing over the previous years. So let's start with the first one here. Bellingcat caught spreading fake news again. This came out on the 28th from the Dissident. Recently, the supposed quote-unquote independent investigative outlet Bellingcat put out a story that alleged that Russia had used chemical weapons on members that attended the peace delegation between Ukraine and Russia. And there's a screenshot of the tweet here. Bellingcat can confirm that 3 members of the delegation attending the peace talks between Ukraine and Russia on the night of 3 to 4 March 2022 experienced symptoms consistent with poisoning with chemical weapons. One of the victims was Russian entrepreneur Roman Abramovich. This allegation gave fodder to the possibility that Russia may use chemical weapons in Ukraine, which Biden said would result in further NATO action in the war. Remember, this was after Biden has come out and said publicly that chemical weapons use is a red line for the United States. So I came out on my show and was telling you what basically the Dissident is tongue-in-cheek telling you. They look to manufacture consent for NATO intervention by, now that Biden has said publicly that we're going to intervene militarily if chemical weapons happen to be used against Ukrainians, then that incentivizes the Ukrainians, which are largely, not largely, but a significant amount motivated by and made up of Nazis who are getting their asses kicked by the Russians, makes them more and more likely to do a false flag to get the United States involved, and that false flag would likely involve chemical weapons. They've done it in Syria, and again, Bellingcat did the same thing back then. That bombing that Trump did was predicated on the fact that everybody thought that Assad was gassing his own people, which it turns out he did not. And Bellingcat was one of the main propagators of that false narrative that drove us to bomb Syria. So they're at it again. Let's keep going. This claim, however, was quickly proven false by Reuters, which reported, quote, a U.S. official said on Monday that intelligence suggests that sickening of Russian billionaire Roman Abramovich and Ukrainian peace negotiators was due to an environmental factor, not poisoning. The article goes on to say that the Wall Street Journal and Bellingcat both falsely reported that this sickening was the result of poisoning with chemical weapons. The question is, why was Bellingcat publishing false information that could manufacture consent for more Western involvement in Russia's invasion of Ukraine? And of course that's rhetorical because he's answering his own question with that question. It's like, that's why they're doing it. They're trying to manufacture consent for escalation. Now, we're going to move on to the second article. I only read about half of that first article, and I do like these articles because they only take about 7 or 8 minutes to read. They're not like some of the other articles I read on this show sometimes will take you 20 minutes. These are very concise and to the point, which I actually really, really like because there's only so many hours in the day to read this stuff. This one came out on March 30th. Beware of Bellingcat, a pro-war propaganda outlet masquerading as independent media. Recently, I published an article showcasing Bellingcat's latest fake news story and showcasing some of their shady connections to the US and UK security states. In this article, I will further report on Bellingcat's lack of expertise, security state connections, and the smearing of the OPCW whistleblowers. Bellingcat was founded by Elliot Higgins, a British blogger who used to write under the pseudonym Brown Moses. As a journalist, Mark Ames pointed out this pseudonym was misleading as it gave the impression he was of Middle Eastern origin, while in reality he is a quote-unquote doughy pinkish Midlands gamer, as Ames put it. Despite being propped up as some kind of expert by mainstream media, Higgins lacks any real expertise. A profile of Higgins in the New York Times stated, quote, Mr. Higgins attributed his skill not to any special knowledge of international conflicts or digital data, but to the hours he had spent playing video games, which he said gave him the idea that any mystery can be cracked. And then it talks a little bit about how he used to sell women's lingerie. I don't care too much about that. We'll go one more paragraph down. Bellingcat is far from independent. They are funded by the CIA cutout, the National Endowment for Democracy, as well as the pro-NATO think tank, the Atlantic Council, which itself is funded by Western governments, oil companies, and arms manufacturers. The U.S. intelligence community is appreciative of Bellingcat's work. An article in Foreign Policy magazine quoted a former CIA deputy chief saying, quote, I don't want to be dramatic, but we love this, referring to Bellingcat's work. No shit. Investigations from multiple independent journalists have exposed Bellingcat's connections to the security state. Journalist Alan MacLeod, which, love Alan MacLeod, I already showcased his work in the first episode. If you haven't seen that, go back and check that out. Journalist Alan MacLeod has exposed that many of Bellingcat's employees come from military and intelligence agencies. For example, one of their investigators, Nick Waters, was an officer in the British Army. One of their contributors, Cameron Culcahoon, spent a decade in Britain's version of the NSA, the GCHQ. Journalist Aaron Mate has reported on an internal UK government review of Bellingcat that stated that Bellingcat was discredited for spreading misinformation and being willing to produce reports for anyone, quote-unquote, willing to pay. Journalist Max Blumenthal has reported on leaked documents that show Bellingcat took part in a covert UK Foreign Office program created to, quote-unquote, weaken Russia. And journalists Matt Kennard and Mark Curtis have reported that after the UK government identified North Macedonia as a priority country, they deployed Bellingcat, which later wrote a report entitled, quote, Russian interference in North Macedonia, a view before the elections. Bellingcat focuses almost entirely on enemies of the US and UK empires, namely Russia and Syria. As the previously mentioned Matt Kennard found last year, Bellingcat published 144 stories on Russia, 244 on Syria, compared to 5 on the UK, and 17 on Saudi Arabia. Bellingcat has also relentlessly attacked the anti-imperialist left. In a ridiculous smear article published in 2019, the site alleged that prominent anti-imperialists were on the payroll of Assad because they received $2,500 from a California-based anti-war nonprofit headed by activist Paul LaRudy that they claimed was an Assad lobby. The piece smeared many prominent anti-imperialists, including the outlets Mint Press News, Black Agenda Report, and Venezuela journalist Max Blumenthal and Rania Khalek, and the commentators Kim Iverson and Jimmy Dore. Bellingcat has also attempted to smear and discredit the OPCW whistleblowers. Now, this is what I was talking about before. For context, Donald Trump bombed Syria in 2018 over an allegation of a chemical weapon attack in the town of Doma. Later, the chemical weapons watchdog, the OPCW, came out with a report that matched the U.S. government line that there was a chlorine attack done by Assad regime in Doma. But later, some of the team's top inspectors released censored documents to WikiLeaks that undermined this narrative. The first attempt was when they published a letter they claimed to have been sent by the OPCW's Director General to the inspectors that debunks the documents released to WikiLeaks. But journalist Aaron Mate exposed that this was a draft letter that was never actually sent to the inspectors. Higgins has even listed the OPCW as a partner of Bellingcat and later backtracked, saying it was, quote-unquote, a copying error. Keep in mind, the UK Foreign Office said Higgins was willing to write reports for, quote-unquote, anyone willing to pay. Is it possible Higgins was working with the OPCW leadership in an attempt to discredit its own dissenting inspectors, who have been supported by Noam Chomsky, Daniel Ellsberg, and the 5 former senior OPCW officials? It's a good question. In another bizarre instance, Bellingcat reporter Nick Waters and HuffPost reporter Chris York sent identical emails to WikiLeaks asking about the OPCW whistleblowers. As journalist Aaron Mate pointed out, this signals that, quote, neither Waters nor York wrote the overlapping questions or text to begin with. They received them instead from a mutual source. So that's interesting. I highly recommend you read these for yourselves. I read to you about half of what the Dissident has been writing over the last couple of weeks, and this is fantastic work. And it's just nice to see and be reminded of exactly who we can and can't trust. You're going to see in an age where propaganda is at a premium and people are willing to pay anybody who's willing to put out propaganda a lot of money, which I won't name any names, but you can see some of the boutique leftist commentators cashing in right now, running with the State Department narrative. And there are other sources that are, of course, just, they're loosely affiliated with the deep state, and they get paid by, they get paid by the billionaire class to run with the State Department narrative, because it's beneficial for those people to remain in power and for us to manufacture consent for war with, in this instance, Russia, or in the past, manufacture consent for more intervention in Syria. So we have to be vigilant and keep our eye on, this is a huge web of connections. The National Endowment for Democracy, a CIA cutout that is really, really closely related to Bellingcat. If you can step back and see all of these connections, it helps you kind of see the web. See exactly how this stuff is all being disseminated, and how something like, let's say, for instance, the Hunter Biden emails story can be completely censored off the internet, while at the same time, a lot of our reporting on my show and on Aaron Mate's show, and Glenn Greenwald cover this as well, for instance, like the Trump Alpha Bank story, can be more or less just conjured up by the Democratic elites and run with entirely, and then even published in a magazine called Slate, and there was nothing to it. There was nothing to it. So it's interesting. You have to step back for a second and see all of these little nodes in the web, and it really gives you a better idea of how sophisticated this propaganda apparatus that we have really is. And I'm not surprised at all. They need it to be, because they're on shaky ground in the United States right now. The propaganda apparatus has to meet the opposition right now. It has to become extremely robust, because we're in end-stage capitalism and the elitists are really in some deep trouble right now. So they need a multi-billion-dollar propaganda apparatus to defend them, to censor the truth tellers, but also, convince a bunch of people that their lies are truth. So thanks to the Dissident for writing these. Keep up the great work. They're part of INN, the Indie News Network, which I'm proud to be a part of as well. And I will link their Substack below, as well as these 2 articles. I recommend you read everything they put out. Keep fighting that good fight out there, guys. Later on today, we'll be doing Chapter 1, or at least the first part of Chapter 1 of Black Shirts and Reds by Michael Parenti. Talk to you guys later.